We have reached the last section of the hand and wrist x-ray course, and we are just going to go over some examples of x-rays now to review everything and put it all together. So I'm going to encourage you to pause the video. We have 3 cases, and once the x-rays are on screen, I encourage you to pause the video and go through the x-ray yourself. Take a piece of paper and write down all the injuries that you identify, and then we can kind of go through the approach together and see if you manage to get all of the injuries. So here is case 1, and I encourage you to pause now and write down any injuries that you're able to identify. If you are coming back, we will start by going through our process. So first we have to make sure that the x-rays are of adequate quality. So we do have 3 views. We have PA, oblique, and lateral. We can see all the bones, maybe slightly cut off at the top there, but we can have a pretty good view. The exposure is okay, and I don't see significant motion artifacts. From first glance, you see that there's an unusual contour here, and that represents a cast or a splint on the outside. You can see the shadow of the soft tissue, and overall it looks pretty good. Maybe a small amount of swelling of the hand, but overall nothing too impressive. A little bit of swelling. Let's now go through all of the hand bones. So kind of individually, you can go through each of the distal phalanges. They all look like they have normal contour. I don't see any obvious fractures or dislocations. Can move on to the middle phalanges. Same thing with those. There's no obvious fracture. There are no obvious dislocations, deformities. And then finally to the proximal. And all of them seem to have intact contours without fractures. Moving on to the metacarpal bones, you can see the sesamoid bones around the thumb metacarpal phalangeal joint. You can see them here again, just as an observation. Then as we continue to examine each of the metacarpals in turn, it jumps out at us that there is a fracture of the neck of the 5th metacarpal with dorsal angulation. That is the definition of a boxer's fracture. The fracture is extra-articular. It doesn't go into that joint. It is angulated, but there's no evidence that we can see, at least based on the x-ray, that there's an open fracture. That would have to be correlated clinically with physical exam. So we see that there's this fracture. However, just because we identify one fracture doesn't mean there can't be other injuries. So we continue to go through the process and examine the rest of the hand. So once we've finished with the metacarpals, I don't see any base fractures. We can go down to the carpal bones. We look at the A's. So the 4 A's are arcs. So we see that the 3 arcs, the galula lines, are nicely aligned there on the PA view. I don't see any step-off deformities. The angles of the radius look appropriate, without calculating them. I don't see any distal radius fractures, and you can see that there's that radial inclination and a bit of that volar tilt as well that appear to be appropriate. Next, you look at the distance between all the carpal bones. They're all about 1 to 2 millimeters. And the final A is alignment, and so we look on the lateral view, and you can see the radius, the lunate, and the capitate appear to have pretty good alignment. So we have not identified any other injuries, and so the final diagnosis is a boxer's fracture. Next, we are at case 2. So once again, I encourage you to pause now and then write down the injuries that you can see on these x-rays. So coming back to the beginning of our process, so we have 3 views. We have good quality x-rays. Look first at the soft tissue. We can see a bit of swelling of the hand. So we can see that it seems maybe a little bit swollen based on the contours. There's no other abnormalities. There's no cast on. I don't see any other foreign bodies. Then moving on to the distal phalanges and then working our way proximal. So we can see, maybe this isn't the best quality x-ray, but I don't see on any of the views any distal phalanx fractures. The middle phalanges then we move on to, although now we look at the middle phalanx of D3 and you see that there's a little crack through it. So that does look like a longitudinal fracture, but it doesn't appear to be displaced. We continue moving on through the proximal phalanges, and we can definitely see some more fractures right off the bat. So going by finger, so the thumb proximal phalanx looks okay. Then we get to D2, D3, and D4, and they all have significant fractures. So D2 has a shaft fracture, and if you look on the lateral and oblique views, you can see that there is that volar angulation there. So significant angulation. D3 and D4 both have shaft fractures as well. However, there doesn't appear to be as significant displacement or angulation based on the other views. However, D2, 3, and 4 kind of all have that shattered appearance, indicating that they are all comminuted fractures. They're all shaft fractures, and it doesn't look like any of them extend into the joint space, so it looks like they're all extra articular. And then we move on to the metacarpals. Don't see any significant fractures of the metacarpals on any of the views, and the alignment looks good. And so we move on to the carpal bones. Our 4As, so the arcs look good. The angles of the distal radius has that radial inclination and volar tilt, as would be expected. And the articulation between all of the carpal bones is approximately 1 to 2 millimeters. And the alignment on the lateral view does appear to be good, with the lunate and the capitate sitting nicely in that line. Thus, our final diagnosis is comminuted fractures of the proximal phalanges of D2, 3, and 4 with significant volar angulation of D2. There is also a longitudinal non-displaced fracture of the D3 middle phalanx. Finally, we will move on to case number 3. So please pause now and write down your injuries. All right, so we're going to start, as always, by ensuring x-ray quality. We have 3 views. We have fairly good exposure and no obvious motion artifacts. So it's easy to just jump right into looking at these x-rays and noticing that something looks off around the carpal bones, but we always need to use a systematic approach to ensure that we don't miss any injuries. So we will start once again with a soft tissue contour. So there does appear to be some swelling, particularly kind of around the palm or wrist area. If you look here, it seems a little bit larger than normal. No foreign bodies are noted. Next, we start with the distal phalanges, and then we move on to the middle, and then the proximal. You can take your time with this, but we do not see any obvious injuries, no obvious fractures, dislocations. Next, we go down to the metacarpals. We can see once again those sesamoid bones. And then at the base of the first metacarpal, there is an abnormality. So it looks like there is a base fracture of that first metacarpal that does extend into that joint. So that looks like an intra-articular fracture. However, there is still part of that thumb base that's preserved. The whole thing doesn't look shattered. I don't see a Y. I just see a single fracture line. So remembering back to the hand fracture video, this looks like a Bennett fracture. So base of the thumb fracture with a single line, fracture line extending into the joint space. So we move on to the other metacarpals, and we do not see any obvious fractures there. However, when we move on to the wrist, we can immediately see some abnormalities. So we can look first for fractures by tracing the bony contours, but this is admittedly a little bit difficult because the bones are quite out of place. We can see a few smaller pieces of bone, which look like avulsion fractures, likely from the scaphoid and distal radius, just based on their location. as well as the trapezium and trapezoid, because it's all on that radial side of the wrist. Next, we attempt to go through the 4As. So first you look on PA view for the arcs, the Galula lines, and right away you can see there's, great difficulty in outlining any of the arcs, particularly the proximal row. The distal row looks a little bit more intact, but that proximal row is quite messy. The articulations between all of the carpal bones are still about 1 to 2 millimeters up here, but down below it seems definitely out of whack. So there's either kind of overlapping or they seem to be out of position and having gaps. The alignment of the or the angles of the radial inclination seem to be okay. It doesn't look like the radius is as affected as some of the carpal bones. And you can see here the volar tilt and here the volar tilt. And then finally, when we look at the alignment on that lateral view, we do see significant dislocation of the scaphoid, lunate, and triquetrum. So of course the lunate, we can see that pretty obviously here. That spilled teacup is quite out of place. So it looks like a true lunate dissociation. It's not sitting in the radius and it's not articulating with the capitate. Both the scaphoid as well is rotated and displaced volarly. So you can kind of see it there. It would be the duck body, and you can kind of see it volarly displaced there. The triquetrum is also rotated and displaced dorsally, and then you can see that best on this lateral view. It's kind of sticking out there where it shouldn't be. Additionally, you can see pretty significant shortening of the entire wrist. You have the radius that's basically just sitting with that distal carpal row. So that's shortening of the entire radiocarpal joint. So having gone through our whole process, taken together, this x-ray shows a Bennett fracture, as well as a proximal carpal row fracture dislocations that involves the scaphoid, lunate, and triquetrum. Congratulations, you have now reached the very end of the hand and wrist x-ray course. I hope that you have learned something about hand and wrist x-rays that you can apply to your future clinical practice. Please do take a couple minutes just to fill out the post-course quiz at the end. It's another 10 questions, and it's useful for you to see if you've learned anything, and it's useful to us to gauge if our quality improvement initiative is working. So I would really appreciate if you could fill that out. Thank you and take care. Bye.